Hi, I'm Mary Ellen, and I'm going to be doing 3 videos on our 2 PowerPoints on developmental assessment to help make up for missing class today. So, let's see. All right. So, the primary objective of the OT practice framework is to make sure that you're looking at engagement in occupations to support the child's participation. So we want to look at, can the child participate in ADLs and play and work? Work, of course, for children being development and education, and as they get older, actual work, such as when teenagers start to want to have jobs and that sort of thing. When you're getting ready to do an evaluation, you want to be thinking about what will the results be used for. Is this for the purposes of looking to see if a child is developing normally? Is this to get a child placed in a program? Is this for parents to be reassured about child's development? What are you trying to do? And who's going to see or use the results? So is it going to go to the parents, the physician, the school district? Even working in an outpatient clinic, I would do assessments that parents use to help kids get services in the school system. And so even not working in the school system, you need to have some understanding of that. And is reimbursement going to affect your decision about what evaluation to use? So if I suspect sensory integration problems, I could choose to use the sensory integration and praxis test, the SIPT, which I am certified to give, but costs about $3,000 or $4,000 to administer. Or am I going to use the sensory profile, which is really quite inexpensive and can gather quite a bit of the same information? So we want to look at an occupational profile. We don't want to just think about range of motion and strength and visual motor skills and things like that. We want to think about the child's occupational history, their patterns of daily living, their interests and values and needs. And when you do your case study for us, you'll be looking at all of these things. So how are you going to obtain that profile? Well, you can informally or formally interview the family and the child. How much you can include the child in the interview, of course, depends on the age and vocal abilities of the child. Speech abilities, how much can they answer questions. You can do observation of the child. It's also a good idea to ask the parents to videotape. For example, if you're really interested in seeing what happens at lunchtime when the child is eating, have the parents set up a camera and videotape, and then there's not you, the extra person in the room, disturbing the normal flow of how that lunch happens. You can do a formal occupational profile such as the COPM, which I assume you learned about last semester in OTS 822, and you may even have looked at it in 820. But that's the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, and it can be used with a family member, or it can be used with a child if they're old enough and able to participate, say 8 or 10. We should always make our evaluations as family-centered as possible. I know you all just finished reading a journal article that talked about the fact that this is relatively easy to do in home health and a little bit more difficult in a clinic and a lot more difficult in school. But something like the sensory profile can be sent home to parents and really help you to include the family's point of view in your assessment. So, what information is collected? Well, why are the family seeking services? Generally it's the family seeking services and the child is coming along, but you do want to consider, what does the child feel is a problem and what does the family feel is a problem? So you want to know what areas of occupation are successful and what are causing problems. And it's good to start with the successful to be positive and then move on to things that are causing problems. And you want to help the family think about what in the context might support or inhibit engagement in the occupations that they want. Do pets get in the way? Do extra siblings get in the way? Does the fact that the backyard doesn't have any grass get in the way, or the fact that the backyard is not fenced and so the child could run off? Or do we live in an apartment where there isn't a backyard available? So you want to think about all these things when you're collecting information. So you want to know the child's occupational history, and the best way to get that is to ask the parents, tell me about the child's day, and from the time they get up to the time they go to bed. And then you can follow that up with, can you tell me about things that the child did in the past, and can they still do them, or have they gotten better at them, or have they moved on from doing them? So you want to know the family and the child's priorities and the desired targeted outcomes. These may not be the same as yours, and the older the child is, the child's priorities might not be the same as the family's priorities. But as occupational therapists, we may think, gee, this kid should be feeding themselves. And yet for the family, the priority might be the child being able to dress themselves. So you want to be very open to what the family and child's priorities are. After you've collected all this data, you are developing a working hypothesis about the family and child's problems and concerns. And you've identified strengths and weaknesses, hopefully, by asking them what is a problem and what isn't. And you want to make a preliminary selection of what outcomes you're going to measure and how you're going to measure them. So some standardized tests, which we'll talk about more in a minute, some of them are meant to be used repeatedly to measure change, and some are not. We'll also be talking about different ways to write measurable goals as we go along here. So, but what do you want to measure? Good place to start. So when you're interviewing with people clinically, not like a COPM, but maybe a more informal interview, is first you want to clarify what the interview is about. When I worked at a large health maintenance organization, I had parents who were sent to see occupational therapy and not told why or what OT does. So you want to make sure that you're all on the same page. You want to be sensitive to the child and the caregiver, and this includes understanding cultural influences. In some cultures, they basically carry the child for the first year. In some cultures, they don't think children should be able to feed themselves until they're 3. In some cultures, it's very impolite to disagree with someone or argue with someone, and so you have to be careful about how you ask questions. Make sure you're not leading or suggesting what an appropriate answer might be to the questions that you're asking. And of course, I think you all know what an open-ended question is. So tell me about feeding times instead of, can your child feed themselves? You want to be positive, you want to be realistic, but don't assume that you know. Not every child who was born prematurely is going to end up with problems. Not every child that's autistic remains the same, or is, resembles each other. So being positive, as I said, starting with what can the child do well. Being flexible. If you can't be flexible, an OT needs to be flexible. So the parents may tell you, I'm really interested in this, and you're not interested in that at all. But you want to go with the parents and see what you can help them with. And if it's something you can't help them with, then let them know that as well. Try to be really aware of your own nonverbal communication. I will never forget, I had a mom come in and she had triplets who were about 15 months old, and I asked her about feeding, and she told me that she still fed them all, and I must have had this look on my face because she looked at me and said, well, when should they be feeding themselves? And I said, well, it depends on the child and their skill level. And she said, well, I said, often when the child starts to reach for the food or reach for the tools of feeding, that's when they're ready to self-feed. And she said, oh, I smack their hands when they do that. And I guess I must have had a horrified look on my face. And when she left, she asked for a different therapist. And fortunately, in that situation, we did have other therapists. But if we hadn't, then those were some children who might not have gotten therapy because I wasn't being aware of enough of my own nonverbal communication, my facial expression, when she asked that question. You also want to try not to use therapy or medical jargon. I know you're spending time learning the OT jargon, but you need to keep in mind that your families don't necessarily know that jargon. So we say ADLs, they say dressing, feeding, bathing, things like that. How does your child take care of themselves? Again, on our practice framework, we do want to look at performance skills and patterns because we're trying to assess what is it that's interfering with the child's ability to do something. We want to look at different kinds of factors that affect the skills and the patterns that are being evaluated. Is it a bad time of day? Are there too many people around? Is there a bird in the background squawking that's distracting? So we want to look at this particular child's facilitators and barriers to engagement in occupation. And we want to help the family to think us about those things, help us to think about those things as well. So we want to use information from our occupational profile. We want to use skilled observations, and we want to use assessments. Some of them are standardized, some of them are not standardized. And you'll learn more about ecological assessments in OTS 830. We're going to talk a little bit more about standardized and non-standardized in the second PowerPoint. So at this point, I'm going to stop with this PowerPoint and we'll start the next PowerPoint at standardized tests.